Hello, so this is a book review about a book which is so good that I've actually already slightly begun, I think, talking about this, or maybe not. Anyway, this book is by Fisher Dieskau. It's translated. It's called Schubert, a biographical study of his songs, and it is really good. So I just wanted to point out. Oh yeah, okay. This is not a book review. This is in order to talk about for example, yeah, I mean, it just talks about how the final the version which Schubert wrote in his autograph is not necessarily the version, which Schubert wanted. So I'm thinking about the D899 number 3, which has a natural in the G. Sorry? Yeah, I'll give it to you in a second, darling, because I'm a bit busy at the moment. Can you wait a second, please? So I think there's a flat in perhaps the D, something like that, or the G. Sorry, it's not a flat, whereas in the autograph version it is a flat. But in the first published version of the D899 impromptu set, it's marked as a natural and sounds much better. You can hear two versions, a version by Horowitz, a version by Richter, where they do, certainly Richter does both versions, if I'm not mistaken. I think Horowitz does just the one with the natural in it, which sounds much better than the one with the flat, as it is in the original manuscript, and which most people play. But actually, it sounds better as a natural, and just this is what Fisher Dieskau, who has a wealth of knowledge, it seems, about everything musical, really. He says, okay, so he says, okay, it's not that bit. Maybe it's here. Yeah, okay, on page 169 it says, so I'll go back a bit. He's talking about okay, I'll read it from the beginning of the page. The chapter is called "The Background to His Illness." It says here, nevertheless, public recognition was growing steadily. The I can't read it, but I think it says the Steiermarkische Musikverein in Graz made him an honorary member, in return for which Schubert presented them with the still unfinished B minor symphony. Then the new publishers, Sauer and Leidersdorf, brought out some male choruses and 5 volumes of songs, amongst them Der Zwerg, opus 22, D771, from a poem by Matthaus von Collin. These volumes show that Schubert had made alterations in the plates after the delivery of the first printing and had added dynamic notations. Okay, this refutes suggestions that Schubert had no say in the publication of his works. He generally revised his manuscripts thoroughly before they were engraved, and hardly a single one went unrevised to print. He made revisions to the music and to the dynamics as well as to the text. So there we go. So it seems to me, he says here, he generally revised his manuscripts thoroughly before they were engraved. So this is Fisher Dieskau saying it, and he's just talks about the volumes that he's talked about. Okay, 5 volumes of Matthaus von Collin, where he made alterations in the plates after the delivery of the first printing and had added dynamic notation. So it seems to be that there's the writing of the manuscript, and then there is the the delivery of the first printing, presumably that's the first printing just for Schubert to check, is this really good enough, because we're about to do 100 copies or 500 copies or whatever, because this is your last chance, this is what the public's going to see. You know, it's slightly different to your manuscript, because this is now on this sort of printing paper. This is what the public will buy. And then Schubert says no to a few things. He adds these things, because then that printed copy probably gets given, or he obviously gives that back to the printing firm, and then the printing firm adds those little alterations, and that is then the final version. I mean, maybe that, who knows if they then send him back his the new printed copy with his alterations. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But the fact is that he does make alterations after his first manuscript. So that to me suggests that, with reference to the D899 number 3, that beautiful, beautiful third impromptu of Schubert, that it's well nigh possible that he had originally, I mean, it's obviously originally did it with a flat on the G, or maybe it's the D. It isn't about the manuscript. It's probably the 15th measure or so. Although it's like that in the manuscript, I'm sure that he would have played it through, and maybe between him having written it or having given it to them and having it being given back to him, he would have tried out something new perhaps, and he would have tried out that natural instead of the flat, or he would have played it, whatever, you know. It would have been after the manuscript. He would have added that, he could have added that natural. So the Fischer-Dieskau says that it's what he did in this instance with the 5 volumes, and he says that it's generally what he did. He generally always revised it after he had given the manuscript to the publishing firm. So I think that's very important, because it's such an important difference between that flat and that natural. And another thing I wanted to talk about, actually, I haven't underlined it, so I don't know where it is, but Fischer-Dieskau also says that that sometimes the publishing firm, he's actually talking with reference to songs, and he said often the publishing firm would I think put down, they would change the key in order for the top note not to be too high. And Schubert, I don't know whether he said Schubert accepted it or he didn't accept it, but on the basis of what we've just read, perhaps he definitely said that he did accept it on occasion, even though he didn't really like to accept it. So that would suggest also why, for example, in the case of the third impromptu, that there's I think I don't know if it was the first published version or not, but anyway, probably not if my flat and natural thing is correct. But nevertheless, there is also a version in G major rather than G flat major. Yeah, there's one in G major. Yeah, so it's just a sharp on the F for that impromptu, and that might well have been the kind of thing which was acceptable to Schubert. I'm not saying necessarily that particular piece, maybe that was different, but given on the basis of what Fischer-Dieskau writes about things being changed in songs to make it easier for the singers, and Schubert being okay with it, he certainly says that in the book, then I think that's an interesting point to make. And also in the E flat major trio number 2, opus 100, I mean, just before I go on, of course I know that only the number 1 and number 2 impromptus were published in Schubert's lifetime, but that's doesn't mean it's impossible that Schubert died before having given his manuscripts for the number 3 and 4 to the publishing firm, and then after he had died, then they came out with with the final versions of number 3 and 4. Say number 3 because that's what I'm talking about. With the alterations in the first edition, which Schubert had stipulated. Okay, so that's just by the way, because of course number 1 and 2 were the only ones actually published in his lifetime, and number 3 and 4 not of that impromptu set. So to just go on about the trio number 2, oh yeah, there's also the fact that it's shortened in the final movement by a number of bars, a number of measures, and the writer of that book is called what's his name? He's called John M. Gingrich. It's called Schubert's Beethoven Project. He says that that's Schubert's one slip up where he didn't remain true to his only. Well, the idea was only allowing to be published what he wanted and not bowing down to the desires of the publishing firm. I mean, that's not what Fischer-Dieskau writes, and this is such an authoritative book, I think, even though I was very much inclined to say that the Gingrich book was amazing. It's published I think in 2000 was it 2005 or something? But this was published in, this one here was published in, translated by Kenneth S. Witten, really well translated. It was published in 1976. But anyway, it's actually, I get the impression it's more authoritative. He goes through, I think, every single song that Schubert wrote. What's so amazing about this book is it's not just about the songs, it's about Schubert's life and all these there are some very, very interesting anecdotes which you don't get anywhere else. I've never read, and documents of friends, the things that the friends have written, which is so interesting. I've read a lot of Schubert books, actually, Schubert biographies, and this is by far the best. It's got by far the most comprehensive sort of compilation of detailed facts about his life, and it's astonishing. So it's not just about his songs, it's an amazing book. Anyway, so I think it's even better than the Gingrich book, which is excellent in itself. In that book, he talks about the trio, and he says that it's cut short and all that. So I think that he's wrong in saying that it is a sort of a mar on Schubert's authenticity, that he allowed the piano trio number 2 to be printed in its truncated version in the final movement. But also, I think that as Fischer-Dieskau says, he was it was like a better idea he had after having given the manuscript to the publisher. Now that piano trio, the quintet was published in 1856, I think, or maybe not. Maybe it's the trio was published in 1856. No, it can't have been. No. The quintet was published in 1856, I think. So much later, after Schubert's death in 1829. But nevertheless, the trio, because he actually heard one of the movements of the trio. We think it was the trio. Maybe it was the Death and the Maiden one, but probably this one. Oh no, I'm talking about the quartet in G major, right? Yeah, that one was but also the trio. Yeah, in that, yes, in his final concert in 1828, I think, but in May or so of 1828, the anniversary of Beethoven's death, actually, he had his concert. The G major, we think, quartet was played there. Maybe it was the Death and the Maiden one, and I think the whole of the trio, not the second trio, was performed. But it wasn't published in his lifetime. So the same thing. I think that he could have already written the manuscript and given it to the publisher, and then he had corrected, I think, what in the same way as I've just been reading about, and what I think happened to the third impromptu. He then corrected what he realised didn't sound that good. He realised that it sounded better in its truncated form. This is in contradistinction to what Gingrich says, and I think that he changed that in the first printed version, which he then gave back to the publishers to have them all printed as. So I think that's why in the for the same reason the original manuscript of the Piano Trio Number 2, I think that the G flat major impromptu is in the same, is like these works, these 5 volumes of songs and the male choruses, some male choruses and 5 volumes of songs were changed. And I think that between the writing of the manuscript and the first published version. So there we go. Sorry if I've repeated myself many times. I'm trying to sort of not get confused by the order of these things. And yeah, so this is what I have to say about Schubert and the publication of his works, and how the original manuscript is not necessarily the way that Schubert wanted it. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll hopefully do a proper review of this whole wonderful, wonderful book later. It's one of the best books I've ever read about Schubert, anyway, and about music in general. And of course, Fischer Dieskau is such a great, great singer. I do think that Ian Bostridge is also very good, I must say. He's got a much higher voice. Another thing he says in this book is that the whole so I think that Ian Bostridge is very good as well. Now, he was a tenor, for Fischer Dieskau. I think Ian Bostridge was perhaps what's it called, the one up from a tenor. Anyway, I think he's a I can't remember, but he's got a higher pitched voice. But he says in this book that all of the Schoenmüllerin songs are for tenor, and I think he said that he said all the songs in the Schoenmüllerin anyway are for tenor. So there we go, which is interesting. That's another little fact. You've got those facts sprinkled everywhere in this book. And of course, he's such a great singer, this Fischer Dieskau. I do like Bostridge as well, but that's an interesting fact. I would really recommend his performance of the Schoenmüllerin. I prefer that to Winterreise, I think. But what he says about Winterreise is also that it's all on the first 2 octaves. Isn't that interesting? So that's not to say that it's easy. I think that they're not easy, but that's an interesting fact. So he knows a lot about the piano as well. Of course, Gerald Moore was his favoured pianist, and he has nothing but good things to say about Gerald Moore. I think that Graham Johnson is also a good pianist. For Schubert's songs, I would recommend Graham Johnson and Felicity Lott, Dame Felicity Lott, for Schubert's songs. I always used to love listening to Felicity Lott sing Schubert Lieder. She's very good. And yeah, so, but of course he wrote, I think, he had in mind anyway, mainly men singers, but I think obviously not only. So Felicity Lott's a soprano, for example, and that works. But I mean, I would prefer a song like Die Musik or Du bist die Ruhe, or for example, for these sorts of songs which have a very high rate, very high, they don't go up to a C or anything, but they're pretty high. That they wouldn't, I don't see how a tenor would manage that, but he would. So I suppose that, but it would be I'm sure that he would have had in mind women singers, and yes, this is what I also want to talk about, is Teresa Grob, which was his first love. And he wrote, I think I've mentioned this before, his first mass, which has the most beautiful Sanctus in it, I believe it is. He wrote it for her to sing. So we know that he wrote some of his vocal works with a female singer in mind, for sure. And it's just that a lot of his works were for male choruses, and his friends were all men, and so he mainly wrote with men in mind, and presumably the tenor range, given that that's what the Muller cycle is, first Muller cycle anyway. But yeah, Teresa Grob, he has some very interesting things to say about his relationship with Teresa Grob. I haven't yet seen whether there's any reference to that other person whom he apparently knew. Well, no, there is. There's more. There's reference to a servant girl who he was friends with as well. Perhaps that's the same one who was alleged to have given him syphilis, but he hasn't written about that here. And according to what's his name? Can't remember his name, but he didn't die of the syphilis. He died of bad fish soup. But of course, he was not healthy, so it may have sped up his imminent death. But he may have recovered from syphilis. It wasn't a fatal illness, and that's what Nikolai Demidenko is who advocates very strongly, that he died because of that bad fish soup, and not because of syphilis. But in any case, apparently he caught the syphilis from a certain woman whose name has been recorded. I can't remember what it is, and I don't think that's the servant girl who Fischer Dieskau has talked about in this book. So he hasn't. Maybe he will, because I haven't yet finished this book. In any case, he mentioned this other woman. He mentioned the fact that Schubert apparently used to. Yeah, he's accused of drinking alcohol, overly drinking. Fischer Dieskau says that he has been accused by others of overly drinking, but he produces ample evidence that he didn't overly drink from his acquaintances, saying that there's only like one occasion, I think, where it says that he was drunk. And that it was wrong to attribute to him drunkenness, basically, he says in this. But many interesting things, that how he apparently used to just sit there amongst his friends, and when he had a little bit too much to drink, but he wasn't drunk or something, he used to apparently just watch them with malicious eyes. I don't know what that means. He used to watch the goings on and smile to himself as he looked on them with malicious eyes. I don't know what that meant, in his gathering of friends and all that. And he also talked about how he what was the other thing? Some quite shocking revelations like that in this book. There's another one. He says how he didn't like the way the women in his Schubertiads, one in particular, and he names her. He mentions her by name, and it's a recorded. Most of these reminiscences, though, are recorded quite a number of years after Schubert's death, so their reliability is a little bit questionable. But apparently he mentioned to his friend that he didn't like the obviously false enthusiasm of some of the women. I think especially this one woman in particular, because he said not only do they not know much about music, but they also don't mean what they say, really. They don't really mean the praises so much as they make out themselves to mean. And then he said, go and get me another drink, would you? In that reminisce from his friend. because he's yeah, all these sorts of interesting reminiscences about Schubert. It's definitely the best book about Schubert by a long, long way. And yeah, it's translated very well. It's constantly interesting. I mean, I find it very, very interesting. Apparently, listen to this. For example, this is page 169. There is a story of Randhartingers that Schubert quickly scribbled down the music to Der Zwerg just before they were setting out for a stroll. Whether one believes it or not, Der Zwerg is an extraordinary piece of futuristic music, which, apart from the fascinating descriptions of human passions, introduces a new way of using brief motifs. This technique appears later in Wagner, where it is employed as an end in itself for extra musical purposes. I mean, it goes on a lot about how way ahead Schubert was, and it not being until people like Wagner and Wolf, Hugo Wolf, that song incorporated these inventions which Schubert had introduced. It's a fascinating read. It's I think it's the best book I've ever read about music, so I'd really recommend it to everybody. Fischer Dieskau, and yeah, Schubert, a biographical study of his songs. So I hope that that's been interesting.